Good morning. First, I'd like to thank SSRS for asking me to talk to you today. My title is Forest Management Squirrels, and I'm going to cover some of the forestry management guidance and activities that Scottish Forestry support within the private sector. So my name is Colin Edwards, and I'm the Environment Policy Advisor with Scottish Forestry. We are the government agency responsible for forest policy, support and regulation. And part of our duty is to encourage the use of the sustainable forest management principles in the management of all of our forest areas. So I'm going to cover some of the guidance that we have in existence at the moment to protect red squirrels and their habitat. I'm going to cover a little bit about stand management, and I'm also going to look at some recent research work that's been done that will help us in the future decide whether or not our policy is adequate or may need to be revised and looked at further. So I'll briefly look at the policy and grant support that's in place, and I'm going to touch on some of the management and guidance that we give to land managers. That's based primarily on the concept of sustainable forest management. Now, sustainable forest management is an internationally recognised approach to managing, and it has three pillars of delivery. There's an economic, a social, and an environmental one. And it's the environmental one that is most important here. The Scottish ministers have full devolved responsibility for forestry in Scotland now, but the UK forestry standard is an approach that is recognised across the entire UK landholding. The forestry standard itself isn't policy. The policy and the aspirations of the government are set out in Scotland's forestry strategy 2019 to 2029. And the strategy provides an overview of where Scottish forestry currently is and our vision for forests and woodlands, including a 10-year framework for action. So within the UKFS, the agreed approach to sustainable forest management across all four administrations has been in place since about 1998, so that's 23 years now. And the Scottish Government are fully committed to the use of the UKFS to help in forests to inform forest planning decisions related to all forests and woodlands. While sustainable forest management is widely seen as positive for the environment, it is recognised that there are associated risks if good practice is not followed. And this is particularly true during tree felling and woodland management activities. Modern forest practice has developed to mitigate environmental risks, and it is important that the sector maintains and develops these practices as they go forward. And that's particularly true of the red squirrel, which is certainly abundant in many of our existing woodlands, both our native and our commercial and managed woodlands. So under our SRDP funding stream, there is an FGS option related to protecting red squirrels. The aim of this option is to support the targeted control of grey squirrels in areas where they are a threat to red squirrels and red squirrel populations. This is an annual recurrent grant to support the labour costs for effective grey squirrel control and includes the setting, monitoring of traps and the humane dispatch of live animals, and the completion and return of cull records for future management evidence. The grant rate is £200 per trap per annum, and it's available up to a maximum of 5 years. Before grant is considered, the owners must have either an approved forest plan, i.e. for woodland areas of 100 hectares or more, or a management plan in areas of less than 100 hectares, or where there is no other forest operational activity, so there is no approved forest plan in place. The numbers of traps and trapping sessions should be proportionate to the grey squirrel population. It should be in one of the areas identified on the indicative strategic priorities for red squirrel conservation map here on your screen, or north of the Highland red squirrel protection line, and as detailed in the revised Scotland strategy for red squirrel conservation. And it must be agreed with the local red squirrel project officer. We highly value the input of the project officers. Their support in helping deliver this grant is certainly. That grant support is there specifically to target grey squirrels to protect red squirrel habitat. But all land managers have a responsibility to understand protection requirements to be provided during forest operations for any protected and priority species located in their property area. To help that, Scottish Forestry have operational guidance notes which cover specific bird and animal species, including one for red squirrels. So that particular note sets out further advice on how managers should plan and carry out forest operations and recreational activities in their woodlands to minimise the possible impacts on red squirrels. Our guidance notes are being reviewed and updated currently, and this will make it clearer that landowners and managers have roles and responsibilities for protecting these species. The fundamental principle remains that managers must conduct an appropriate survey for protected species before operations begin, making plans to ensure species are not harmed, and where necessary, this should include the application for species licenses from Nature Scot. The intention will be to retain a balance so that foresters and other land managers take reasonable precautions to try and avoid impacts on protected species without placing disproportionate restrictions on forestry and other legitimate forms of land management. And some new published research is emerging that we will look at and carefully consider in the development of this guidance note and any additional management activity that we may give in the future. So that effort and resources are targeted to offer the greatest benefit to red squirrel, we identified the most important actions that we could take for red squirrels. This included development of red squirrel strongholds. So it's a series of large public and private forests managed as long-term red squirrel strongholds. We have established 18 of these public and private forest areas, as well as the island of Arran, as these red squirrel stronghold areas, with more than 2/3 of the stronghold areas located on the National Forest and Land Estate. For stronghold areas on private land, we have helped land managers develop their woodland appropriately. Out with these sites, land managers will be encouraged to incorporate stronghold principles wherever the squirrel. And recent research work has looked at model predictions of red squirrel and grey squirrel populations based on different management scenarios. So the UK Forestry Scheme Standard Forest Management approach and the Stronghold Management approach using the principles outlined in the previous slide. The authors of that work concluded that where grey squirrels are present, managing stands using the principles developed for strongholds gave red squirrels an advantage. In these cases, red squirrels would be secure in the strongholds identified. However, if grey squirrels were not present, red squirrels thrived under UKFS management principles, that is the sustainable forest management that's practiced across most of the forest estate in Scotland. This was not entirely expected and has led to further work looking at where natural strongholds may well be located. That work, supported by Forestry and Land Scotland, has highlighted the existence of forest areas, so natural strongholds, north of the grey squirrel control boundary that would currently support viable red squirrel populations without the need for species-specific management, so i.e. stronghold management. Many of these strongholds are commercial plantations with a range of species present and are under sustainable forest management, not specific for red squirrels. The authors suggest this modelling work on natural strongholds, grey squirrels population modelling together with the recent published results presented in the last slide, support the need for a review of guidance better target effort and resources for red squirrel conservation in Scotland. Further work done by Louise de Ladd, Peter Lurtz and Kenny Cortland, who radio tracked red squirrels before, during and after a standard forest thinning operation, has been published recently as well. That study investigated red squirrel responses to forest management activities, specifically standard thinning operations, on red squirrel breeding activity, survival, population density and home range. Radio-tracked red squirrel survival was relatively high compared to sites without forest operations, and breeding activity continued with no detectable impact on forest operations. Red squirrel population density was higher after thinning operations than prior to it. While space use changed for a handful of individuals, home ranges in core areas overall did not significantly change in response to thinning operations. Their findings strongly suggest the impact of the standard thinning operations using best practice on squirrel activity during the breeding season were minimal. Their work also looked at the use and occupancy of nest boxes erected close to the site and on the use of dray surveys. So the research to date has shown that dray use is very flexible in red squirrels. They use many more drays than will have been identified during initial survey, and it's now suggested that these will most likely be drays that are no longer in use. So red squirrel are capable of building new drays in such a short space of time and are even likely to already have been using adjacent areas, depending on how adjacent and how separated this larger block is from the existing population range. They propose that nest boxes could be a useful conservation tool to mitigate the impacts of forest operations, and they conclude that the early development of these nest boxes in sites that are suboptimal for red squirrels, in areas of low food availability, or in areas with low populations that can contribute to red squirrel conservation by providing shelter for red squirrels after forest operations, and potentially for juveniles during natal dispersal. This is potentially important work that we'll be looking at more closely to see how it modifies our. So just to summarise the majority of my presentation, our operational guidance is being updated at present, and this will better protect red squirrel populations in the future. We're working closely with NatureScot and with Police Scotland Wildlife Crime Unit to ensure that the guidance that we give out is appropriate, proportionate for all of the species that we have identified as requiring guidance. The natural strongholds in Scotland have been identified where red squirrels will survive, and these are slightly different to the existing squirrel strongholds that we have. And recent research results indicate that some species-specific forest management for red squirrel conservation in the absence of grey squirrels would not be required. It was clear from modelling work that UKFS sustainable forest management approaches is suitable for red squirrels where grey squirrels are absent. Additionally, new research is suggesting surveys are of limited value beyond confirming red squirrel presence. This will be important to look at very carefully because it will inform the process that we require forest managers to go under before they get a felling permission for a particular area where we suspect red squirrels are present. And during thinning operations themselves, when these are carried out under best practice, the research has found no effects on residual red squirrel populations. And in fact, the evidence suggests that the populations were doing better following operations than prior to the thinning. Thank you all for your attention. I'm sorry I'm not present to take any questions, but if people want to ask me anything specific about this work, they're welcome to email me at my address, which is colin.edwards@forestry.gov.scot. Thank you very much.